Education suffered when the federal government tried to give too much direction to local schools. Yes, the federal government tried to buy much too much for its less than 7% of funding. Some seem to think that education is best directed by administrators in Washington. Well, I say the American people know better than anyone in Washington how to fix their own schools.
We're back with The Big Deal. I'm Errol Louis. This week, President-elect Donald Trump announced that his pick to run the Federal Department of Education is Linda McMahon, a former pro wrestling executive who ran the Small Business Administration in Trump's first term. The president-elect has vowed to eliminate the Education Department, but its elimination in total might require action from Congress. If Trump should follow through on his promise, the potential effect on American education could be immense. To understand more, we have to look at why the Education Department was created in the first place and what exactly it does. The Department of Education was originally part of the government's Department of Health, Education, and Welfare. That was up until 1980, when then-President Jimmy Carter signed a law dividing it into two, the Education Department and the Department of Health and Human Services. Now, by law, the department advises and supports schools and universities around the country by distributing millions of dollars in funding, enforcing civil rights laws to prohibit discrimination, bringing national attention to major issues across education, and collecting data from schools in order to carry out research on education. The federal department does not have a direct role in setting school policies. State and local governments dictate school curricula and set rules and provide 90% of the funding for K through 12 education. So what does it really mean when Donald Trump promises to get rid of this department and return responsibility to the states? Joining me now to break it all down is Pallas, a professor at Teachers College, which is part of Columbia University. Great to see you, Professor. And let's say Donald Trump is successful in getting this done. The things that we've read about in Project 2025 and other proposals on how to eliminate the Department of Education really transfers a lot of the responsibility elsewhere. One of the biggest ones, of course, is the student loan program. What would happen to borrowers? What would happen to student debt if it were suddenly transferred out of the Department of Education and over to Treasury or some other agency?
I don't think there would be much immediate impact on borrowers. Certainly the flashpoint recently has been around debt forgiveness, and that's something that the President-elect and the Secretary of Education can overturn with the stroke of a pen. But the reality is the Federal Department of Education does administer billions of dollars of student loans for post-secondary education, and those will continue. So the transfer is unlikely to really have much of an effect on the ability of students to be able to borrow. Now, if there are loan caps, which is one of the proposals, that could make it more difficult for students to be able to secure lower cost loans from the federal government to be able to support their post-secondary schooling.
There's also this idea of transferring management of Title I funding, those for schools in low-income communities, transferring that to the Department of Health and Human Services for distribution to states, mostly through block grants. Let's look at some of the states. We've got a map of the states that are getting most of this funding. I guess the question is whether this is just a bureaucratic change or is it really a cut in disguise? What would happen to people in local communities? Would they end up with less support through this?
That's a possibility. I mean, one of the things that there's always been in American public policy is a tension between choice and equity. So giving states more control gives states more choice, but it runs the risk of creating inequities in how funds are distributed across communities. Title I is earmarked to serve children who are attending schools with concentrations of poverty. If that were somehow to be weakened through block grants, that would be bad for kids in New York City and elsewhere.
The debate over the federal role in education has been going on for decades. Specifically, it has been a target for a long, long time, going all the way back to Ronald Reagan's presidency. Let's take a look at some of what we've seen over the years.
Education suffered when the federal government tried to give too much direction to local schools. Yes, the federal government tried to buy much too much for its less than 7% of funding. Some seem to think that education is best directed by administrators in Washington. Well, I say the American people know better than anyone in Washington how to fix their own schools.
Why have two generations of Republicans been so determined to try and, I guess, follow that advice and dismantle this department?
I think they like smaller government, and a federal agency represents bigger government. Although it's true, as you've pointed out, that many of the proposals for dismantling the Department of Education simply move the functions of the department elsewhere. Now, there is a risk when there's a less centralized bully pulpit for the federal role in education, but most of the functions are probably not going to go away. And I think one of the reasons why Republicans have been unsuccessful in eliminating the Department of Education is that there are a lot of stakeholders who depend on the federal funds and policies and programs that flow from the Department of Education. So members of Congress, even on the right, still have to deal with constituents who really want these services to continue.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk a little bit about Linda McMahon, a co-owner of the World Wrestling Entertainment who led the Small Business Administration in the first term of Donald Trump. Her job would essentially be to try and figure out how to do that, how to transfer a lot of the functions, downscale some of the other ones. Can somebody with no experience or direct experience as an educator really do that, or is this mostly a bureaucratic and political job?
I think it requires a lot of political expertise, which Linda McMahon does not seem to have, neither a lot of education expertise nor political expertise. She was, of course, the head of the Small Business Administration in the first Trump administration. On the education side, serving for a year on the Connecticut State Board of Education as an appointee, serving as a trustee on the Board of Trustees at Sacred Heart University in Connecticut. But it's not a broad footprint that would seemingly give her a lot of expertise in managing these complex processes.
And then I guess finally, the Office of Civil Rights within the Department of Education conducts investigations. It issues guidance on how civil rights should be applied. The Biden administration actually used that power to prohibit schools from discriminating against transgender students. If that's transferred either to the Department of Justice or the Department of Education goes away, as is planned, what could end up happening in those kind of cases?
Well, there certainly could be a weakening of the enforcement of federal civil rights laws, and that is a serious concern. The issues regarding gender and sexual orientation and Title IX, the Obama administration put in place policies. They were reversed by Trump. They were reversed by Biden. They're likely to be reversed again in the second Trump administration. So there are things that can be done via the stroke of a pen regarding policies and interpretations of the law. Mm-hmm. But the weakening of the Civil Rights Office, I think, is a serious threat.
Okay. Professor Pallas, thank you so much for that guidance and insight. Thank you for watching our YouTube channel. Let Spectrum News be your resource for balanced, in-depth political coverage, and click the subscribe button right here. You can also download our app or watch us on TV to learn more about the candidates, where they stand on the issues, and more. We'll see you then.